My name is Margaret, and life has brought me challenges that I never would have imagined facing. I was a single mother to 5 wonderful children: John, Michael, Sarah, Emily, and David. I vividly remember the day my husband, Tom, left us. He left home never to return, following a new life with another woman. The shock and pain were immense, but I knew I needed to be strong for my children. From that moment on, I dedicated my life to raising and supporting my family alone, facing every adversity with courage and determination. The years that followed were full of challenges. I worked 2 jobs, doing everything I could to make sure my children didn't want anything. Early in the morning, before dawn, I was up, preparing breakfast and getting them ready for school. My day was a marathon of work and childcare. At night, after putting them to bed, I often found myself crying from exhaustion, but I never let them see my despair. I wanted them to grow up in a home full of love and security, even if it was just me to provide that. Every little advance my children made was a triumph for me. When John took his first steps, I felt a wave of joy that made me forget, even if momentarily, all the difficulties. Michael was always the most curious, filling the house with his incessant questions. Sarah and Emily, with their laughter and jokes, brought a lightness to the environment, while David, the youngest, with his contagious smile, was the light of my days. Their every achievement, every small victory, was a reminder of why I fought so hard. Evenings were the time when we got together as a family. I made sure that, despite the busyness of everyday life, we had time together at the dinner table. I prepared simple meals, but made with all love. Our conversations revolved around school, friends, and dreams for the future. It was in these moments that I felt the strength of our union. Each of them had their own personality and dreams, and I made a point of supporting and encouraging each one. I have always made a point of being present at all the important moments in my children's lives. Whether it was a school performance, a football game, or a play, I was there, applauding and encouraging. I made silent sacrifices, often setting aside my own needs to ensure they had what they needed. The reward was seeing them happy and fulfilled, knowing that, despite all the difficulties, they were growing up in a home full of love. The memories of those early years are a mix of struggle and happiness. I remember sleepless nights, worried about the future, and sunny mornings, full of hope and joy, helping them with their homework, healing injuries, and offering advice. These were my responsibilities, and, despite my tiredness, they were also my greatest joys. Life wasn't easy, but every smile, every hug, and every "I love you, Mom," made it all worth it. Today, looking back, I see that those years were the most intense and rewarding of my life. I managed to raise 5 wonderful children, each with their own achievements and personalities. Despite Tom's absence, we managed to build a strong and united family. These early years were proof that a mother's love can overcome any obstacle. Over the years, my children grew up and followed their own paths. John, always the most responsible, was the first to get married. I remember your wedding ceremony, a mixture of pride and sadness in my heart. Seeing my firstborn start his own family was a milestone, but also the beginning of a new phase in my life. Soon after, Michael, with his adventurous spirit, also found his mate. The house, which had previously been a whirlwind of activity, began to grow a little quieter. After Michael, it was Sarah's turn, my first girl. She was always so sweet and caring, and her wedding was a beautiful celebration of love. Emily, the family artist, followed next. Her talents and dreams took her far, and I knew the world was opening up to her in ways she always wanted. David, the youngest, was the last to leave the nest. His departure was the hardest for me, perhaps because he was the youngest, or perhaps because he was the last tangible link to my children's childhood. The house, which had once vibrated with laughter, conversation, and even the occasional fight, became increasingly silent. Each empty room was a reminder of the passage of time and life's inevitable changes. I spent most of my time alone, walking the halls and remembering happy moments. The photographs on the walls and the personal items they left behind became my constant companions. I missed the buzz that my children brought, the everyday stories, the shared worries and joys. The mornings, before so hurried and chaotic, were now too peaceful. Preparing breakfast just for myself was a lonely ritual. Sometimes I found myself preparing larger portions, forgetting for a moment that there was no one else to join me at the table. Their absence was palpable, a constant presence in their absence. I was proud of my children and their achievements. They were building their own lives and families, achieving their dreams and finding happiness. I knew this was the natural order of things, and that they needed to move on. However, this did not lessen the longing he felt, nor the feeling of emptiness that filled the house. Sometimes I would get occasional phone calls or visits, and those moments were precious to me. However, the visits never lasted as long as I would have liked, and the phone calls, while comforting, were no substitute for being physically present with my children. I learned to value every second I spent with them, knowing that these opportunities would become increasingly rare. Over time, I started finding new ways to fill my days. I joined local clubs, started volunteering, and rediscovered old hobbies. However, the emptiness in the house never completely disappeared. It was a constant reminder of the love I still felt for my children and the desire to be closer to them. It was on one of those silent days that I started to realize something wasn't right with me. I was in the kitchen, preparing a simple meal, when I realized I couldn't remember where I put the salt shaker. I looked through all the cupboards one by one and still couldn't find it. It was a small flaw, but the discomfort I felt was disproportionate. A short time later, I found the salt shaker inside the refrigerator. I smiled and shook my head, trying not to make too much of the incident. A few days later, while walking around the neighborhood, I ran into a longtime neighbor. We talked for a few minutes, but I couldn't remember her name. I pretended everything was normal, smiling and waving, but inside, I felt restless. This failure disturbed me more than the salt shaker story. I began to wonder if these small memory lapses were normal, or if something more serious was happening. The weeks passed, and the small glitches started to become more frequent. Sometimes I couldn't remember where I parked my car at the supermarket, or I forgot important appointments. I started writing everything down in a notebook that I carried with me, trying to keep track. However, the feeling that something was wrong didn't leave me. It was as if a shadow was slowly approaching, threatening my peace of mind. One afternoon, while I was in the garden tending to the plants, I realized that I couldn't remember Michael's birthday. This was a detail that had never escaped me before. Fear began to grow inside me. Was it just normal aging? Or was there something more sinister behind these memory lapses? I began to avoid talking about these incidents with my children for fear of worrying them or appearing fragile. I began discreetly looking for answers. I researched aging and memory problems, trying to find some explanation that would reassure me. The information I found was varied and often conflicting. Some said these lapses were normal for my age, while others suggested they could be signs of something more serious. The uncertainty was distressing. I talked to Helen, my friend and neighbor, about my concerns. She was understanding and encouraged me to see a doctor. I was reluctant at first, fearing a diagnosis I didn't want to hear. However, I knew I needed to face reality, no matter how scary it might be. I made an appointment and, with a heavy heart, prepared myself for whatever came next. The appointment was a mix of relief and anxiety. The doctor was kind and attentive, listening to all my concerns. We ran a series of tests, and he explained that it would take more time to get a conclusive diagnosis. I left the office with a feeling of uncertainty, but also with renewed determination. I knew I was just at the beginning of a difficult journey, but I was willing to face whatever came my way. After much insistence from my friend and neighbor, Helen, I went to the doctor. The decision wasn't easy, but I knew I couldn't continue ignoring the signs. The appointment was long and involved several memory tests and neurological exams. The doctor, Dr. Thompson, was a kind and understanding man, but his worried look only increased my anxiety. After weeks of agonizing waiting, I was called back to the office to receive the results. Dr. Thompson received me with a serious face. He explained, gently, that my tests indicated the presence of Alzheimer's. I felt as if the ground had disappeared beneath my feet. His words echoed in my mind, but it seemed difficult to believe that this was happening to me. My thoughts immediately went to my children and how this news would impact us all. It was a diagnosis I feared but never really expected to hear. At that moment, my mind was invaded by a flood of worries. What would the future be like? Who would take care of me when I could no longer take care of myself? The fear of the progressive loss of my memories, of my identity, terrified me. Dr. Thompson talked about treatments that could slow the progression of the disease, but I knew there was no cure. The prospect of facing this battle alone was overwhelming. After leaving the office, I sat in the car and let the tears flow. I felt a mixture of deep sadness and helplessness. After a while, I wiped my face, took a deep breath, and decided I needed to share the news with my children. I hoped they would give me the support and comfort I so desperately needed. I called John first, my anchor through many difficult times. The call was brief, and he promised to bring the brothers together to discuss what to do. I told each of my children, in separate calls, about the diagnosis. Their reaction was a mix of shock and silence. They didn't know what to say, and I could feel the distance in their voices. Michael asked about next medical steps, Sarah offered her condolences, Emily tried to be positive, and David, the youngest, just stayed silent. The disconnect between us was palpable, and I began to wonder if I could really count on them for this new phase of my life. In the days that followed, I waited anxiously for a plan of action from my children, but the answers were vague and indefinite. Each of them seemed too involved in their own lives to truly understand the gravity of the situation. Promises of visits and practical support sounded more like obligations than genuine offers of help. The weight of the diagnosis intensified with the realization that I could face this more alone than I imagined. Eventually, my children decided to meet at home to discuss the situation. I was hopeful, thinking that they would finally take concrete action. However, the meeting was tense and full of practical suggestions, but without real empathy. They talked about possibilities for outside care and about reorganizing my finances to pay for professional help. The love and compassion I craved were absent. I left that meeting with a heavy heart, aware that the battle I faced would be even lonelier than I feared. To my surprise, my children's reaction was distant. John, always so responsible, explained that his work required a lot of time and energy and that he could not be available to help me as he would have liked. He suggested that we hire a professional caregiver to help me. Michael, busy with his business trips and a young family, said his schedule didn't allow him to be there as often as necessary. His suggestion was to look for an institution specializing in Alzheimer's. Sarah, who was always so caring, was overwhelmed with her own responsibilities as a mother of 3 young children. He said that although he wanted to be there for me, he just couldn't find the time to do so. Emily, who lived in another city, explained that the distance made a constant presence impossible and suggested that I move to a nursing home where I could receive adequate care. David, my youngest, was still finding his way in life, and although he wanted to help, he didn't have the resources or stability to do so. Each had a different excuse, and although their justifications were understandable, they did not lessen the pain I felt. It was a hard blow to realize that those for whom I sacrificed so much couldn't or wouldn't be by my side during this difficult time. The feeling of abandonment was overwhelming, and I wondered where I had gone wrong in raising my children. Did I fail to teach them the importance of family and caring for each other? In the days and weeks that followed, the distance between us only grew. The visits and calls became increasingly sporadic, and I felt like I was being pushed out of their lives. The house that was once full of life was now a place of solitude and silence. I spent my days remembering happy moments from the past, trying to find solace in the memories that still remained. The lack of emotional support from my children was devastating. Every excuse they made, every unfulfilled promise, increased my feeling of isolation. Helen, my neighbor and longtime friend, became my main support. She came to visit me regularly, bringing food and company. While I was grateful for their friendship, it wasn't the same as having my children by my side. As the disease progressed, my independence quickly diminished. Daily tasks became challenging, and mental confusion became more frequent. In a moment of desperation, I called John, begging for help. He promised to do his best, but his actions did not match his words. Frustration and fear began to take over me. Each day, the reality of my situation became clearer. I was alone in this fight. Finally, the day came when my children decided that I should move into a nursing home. It was a decision made with a practical coldness that left me devastated. They assured me it would be the best for me, where I would receive the care I needed. Deep down, I knew they were relieved not to have to deal with my condition directly. I was taken to the asylum with a suitcase of clothes and a heart full of sadness. The feeling of abandonment was complete, and I prepared to face my final days in a strange place without the presence of my children. As time passed, my condition worsened. At first, it was just small memory lapses, like forgetting where I left my glasses or not remembering a neighbor's name. However, these episodes quickly became more frequent and intense. I started forgetting more important things, like forgetting to eat or take my medication. I was once found wandering around the neighborhood without knowing where I was, and this alarmed everyone. My children started to worry more, but instead of getting closer, they seemed to move even further away. They scheduled a family meeting to discuss my future. John, always the most pragmatic, started the conversation. He argued that with my growing needs, it would be impossible to continue living alone. Michael, with his always rational tone, agreed, highlighting the risks I was taking by staying at home. Sarah, visibly shaken, cried as she tried to explain that, with her life already so full, she couldn't give me the support I needed. Emily, her voice breaking, suggested asylum as the best solution. David, the youngest and most emotional, remained silent for most of the meeting, only nodding in agreement with his brother's decisions. I was sitting among them, listening to everything in devastating silence. I felt like I was being judged and condemned, without having the chance to defend myself. The decision was taken almost unanimously. They decided that the best place for me would be a nursing home, where I could receive professional care and be safe. They assured me that they would choose a good place, a place where I would be treated well. But her words couldn't mask the reality. I was being taken away from everything I knew, from my home, from my memories, from my family. I felt a deep sadness, a feeling of abandonment that I had never experienced before. That night, I returned home with a heavy heart. Helen came to visit me and, upon seeing my condition, offered me comfort. I vented to her, crying and expressing my fear and sadness. She held my hand and promised she would always be there, but I knew that wouldn't replace my children's support. The decision had been made, and I had no choice but to accept it. The move to the asylum was quick. My children organized everything, and I soon found myself in a small, impersonal room with only a few reminders of home to comfort me. The nurses were kind, but I couldn't shake the feeling of desolation. My home, the place where I raised my children, was now empty. I was in a strange place, surrounded by unfamiliar faces. Adapting was difficult. Every day felt like a challenge, and loneliness was my constant companion. My children promised regular visits, but the promises didn't always come true. I eagerly awaited each visit, each phone call, trying to find some comfort in their presence. However, over time, the visits became less frequent, and I found myself increasingly isolated. My condition continued to deteriorate, and the emptiness in my heart only grew. The asylum was a cold and impersonal place. The first thing I noticed upon arriving was the sterile smell of disinfectant, which seemed to permeate everything around me. The walls were a stark white, decorated with generic pictures that did little to alleviate the hospital feel. My room, small and functional, lacked the warmth of home. There was a bed, a chair, and a small table, but what bothered me most was the absence of the memories that inhabited my old home. The nurses were attentive and did their best to comfort us. They helped me with daily tasks, administered my medications, and tried to involve all the residents in group activities. Despite their efforts, nothing compared to the affection and love of a family. Conversations were brief and matter-of-fact, lacking the warmth and intimacy of family interactions. I deeply missed the times when my children were around, even with all the difficulties. I missed my children and grandchildren in a visceral way. I remembered when the house was full of laughter, lively discussions, and the constant sound of life in motion. Now, the silence was broken only by the footsteps of employees and the occasional sound of a distant television. My children's visits were rare and short, often more out of obligation than out of a genuine desire to be with me. They came with worried expressions, spent a few minutes, and then quickly departed for their busy lives. Time passed slowly in the asylum. The days blended into a monotonous repetition of routines, punctuated by tasteless meals and activities that interested me little. I tried to engage, but my heart wasn't there. I felt increasingly disconnected from the outside world, as if I were trapped in a bubble that isolated me from everything and everyone that was once dear to me. Each day became more difficult to bear. The memories, once clear and vivid, began to fade, becoming indistinct blurs in my mind. Loneliness weighed more and more, and I often found myself crying in silence, wishing I could go back in time. I looked at the photographs of my children and grandchildren that I brought with me, seeking some solace in those frozen images of the past. The few friendships I made at the asylum were superficial. Everyone there was fighting their own battles, and the camaraderie was more about convenience than true connection. I missed meaningful conversations, shared laughter, and comforting hugs. My life was all about waiting for visits, for letters, for any sign that I was still remembered and loved. As the disease progressed, my independence became increasingly limited. The frustration of not being able to perform simple tasks increased the feeling of despair. The memories of happy moments with my family were like a distant lighthouse, almost unreachable. I lived each day with the hope of a surprise visit, an unexpected phone call, but most of the time, those hopes faded with the sunset. Life in the asylum was an existence marked by loneliness and the slow erasure of memories. The loneliness in the asylum was overwhelming. The feeling of isolation permeated every aspect of my life. I spent hours looking out the window, watching the world outside, which continued to spin while I was confined to my small room. The trees swaying in the wind, the children playing in the park next door, and the birds flying freely seemed so distant, almost unreal. It was hard to believe that one day I too was part of that vibrant, lively world. I constantly remembered the happy moments I had with my children. John, with his shy smile as he won his first football trophy. Michael, always full of questions and curiosities about the world. Sarah and Emily, with their jokes and laughter. And David, my youngest, with his sweet and affectionate look. Each memory was a treasure that I held dearly. I would sit in the chair next to the window, close my eyes and allow myself to relive those moments, even if only in my mind. The memories, though jumbled and fragmented, were my only solace. The illness gradually robbed me of the clarity of these memories, transforming them into vague, indistinct shadows. I tried to hold on to them, but, like sand slipping between my fingers, they slowly faded away. Sometimes the memories blended together, creating a patchwork of past and present that I could barely understand. It was a constant effort to try to separate the real from the imaginary. As the disease progressed, even these memories began to disappear. Moments that were once crystal clear now seemed covered in a thick fog. Forgetting the faces of my young children, the sound of their voices laughing, or even the details of important events, was an almost unbearable pain. It was like losing parts of myself, pieces of my soul that dissipated in the wind. The loneliness intensified every day. My children's sporadic visits couldn't fill the emptiness that grew inside me. Their lives moved forward, while mine seemed stuck at a point of constant suffering. The lack of human contact, meaningful conversations, and comforting touches made each day a silent battle against despair. Time seemed to drag by, each minute lasting an eternity. Even interactions with other nursing home residents could not alleviate the loneliness. Everyone there had their own struggles, their own pain. Conversations were brief and often repetitive, as we were all trapped in our own bubbles of grief. I longed for a hug, for a moment of true connection, but it rarely happened. It was as if we were all together, but eternally separated by the invisible barrier of illness and old age. The feeling of isolation became my constant companion. I tried to find solace in the daily routine, in the nurses' small gestures of kindness, but nothing seemed to fill the void left by my family's absence. The loneliness in the asylum was a constant reminder of everything I had lost and everything I would never have again. With each passing day, I found myself more trapped in the darkness of oblivion, with loneliness as my only faithful companion. My health continued to deteriorate relentlessly. What were once just small lapses in memory turned into deep and frequent forgetfulness. The simplest tasks, like getting dressed or showering, became impossible without the nurse's help. Each loss of capacity was a blow to my autonomy and self-esteem. I felt like a burden, both to the caregivers and to my children. Total dependence on other people to carry out daily activities was humiliating and painful. I felt like a shadow of what I once was. The caregivers did their best to be kind and understanding, but I could see the tiredness in their eyes. Every time they needed to help me, every time I forgot something important, I felt like an unwanted weight. The frustration and sadness increased every day. I desperately wanted to be independent, but my body and mind continually betrayed me. Visits from my children, which were already rare, became even less frequent. John, Michael, Sarah, Emily, and David seemed more distant than ever. With each canceled visit, with each unanswered phone call, I felt more abandoned and isolated. They had their own lives, their own families and responsibilities. I understood this, but understanding did not alleviate the pain of loneliness and abandonment. Every day without seeing them was an eternity of sadness and despair. I was fighting a disease that robbed not only my memory, but also my dignity. Mental confusion became more frequent and frightening. Sometimes I didn't recognize my own reflection in the mirror, and other times I forgot where I was. The nights were especially difficult, full of nightmares and confusion. The nurses often had to calm me down, and each episode of panic made me feel even more helpless. The loss of memory was devastating, but the loss of dignity was unbearable. Needing help with everything, from eating to going to the bathroom, was humiliating. It reminded me of when I was a strong, independent woman, raising 5 children alone. Now, he couldn't even remember their faces clearly. The illness was erasing my identity, turning me into an empty shell. I was alone in my fight. The nurses, no matter how dedicated they were, could not fill the void left by my family's absence. The nursing home's other residents were also caught up in their own battles with age and illness. The feeling of isolation was absolute. I felt forgotten by the world, a lost soul waiting for the end. The progression of the disease was rapid and cruel. Every day was a new loss, a new humiliation. It wasn't just my memory that was disappearing, but my essence, my humanity. I felt invisible, a presence that was slowly fading. The dignity I had tried to maintain my entire life was shattering before my eyes, and all that was left was a deep, unrelenting emptiness. Every now and then, one of my children would drop by for a quick visit. These moments were like rays of sunshine on cloudy days, but even so, they were far from comforting. John came from time to time, usually on weekends, between appointments. He would sit next to me, hold my hand for a few minutes, ask about my condition, and then check his watch frequently, visibly anxious to leave. I could feel his impatience, his need to be somewhere else. When Michael showed up, it was always a brief and eventful visit. He spoke quickly about his life, his children, his travels. He brought gifts, but his gaze was always distant, as if his mind was somewhere else. The conversations were superficial, and I felt like he was more concerned about fulfilling an obligation than actually being present with me. Each goodbye was a painful reminder that I was no longer a priority in his life. Sarah, with her generous heart, tried to be present, but her visits were also quick and sporadic. She came with her small children, who ran around the room, filling the room with brief joy. However, the visit ended as quickly as it began. She always had something urgent to do, some commitment that couldn't be postponed. I saw the weariness in her eyes, and I knew she was torn between her own family and her duty to visit me. Emily, my artistic daughter, came less often. His visits were surrounded by excuses about distance and lack of time. When he was there, he tried to cheer me up with stories of his new creations and projects. However, his presence was fleeting, and the feeling of it being just a quick stop in his busy schedule was evident. I felt guilty for wanting more from her, knowing that her life was so full of adventures and dreams. David, my youngest, appeared unpredictably. His visits were the most emotional, but also the most painful. He came with the best of intentions, trying to bring joy and comfort. However, his youth and inexperience made him quickly feel overwhelmed and uncomfortable. Each visit ended with a tight hug and promises to come back more often, promises that were rarely kept. They were always in a hurry, they always had something more important to do. Their visits, no matter how much they tried to appear concerned and attentive, were marked by haste and superficiality. I knew they were just fulfilling an obligation, doing the minimum necessary to ease their consciences. This hurt more than the illness itself. The feeling of being an obligation to my children, rather than a loved and valued mother, was a deep and constant blow. These sporadic visits left a bitter taste. Instead of bringing me joy, they only highlighted my isolation and the emotional distance that had formed between us. Each goodbye was a reminder that I was alone, fighting a cruel disease, while my children went on with their lives. The loneliness deepened, and the pain of being seen as just a burden increased with each quick and disinterested visit. There came a point where I started to forget the faces of my own children. It was a terrifying feeling, as if pieces of my life were being slowly ripped away. John, Michael, Sarah, Emily, and David, whose faces had once been so familiar and comforting, began to turn into indistinct blurs in my mind. I tried desperately to hold on to any fragment of memory, but they slipped like sand between my fingers. I couldn't remember the moments we spent together, the laughs shared on game nights, the deep conversations about your dreams and fears, the warm hugs on tough days. All of it was fading. The memories of their first steps, their innocent smiles and their voices calling out to me have become distant echoes, lost in a maze of confusion and oblivion. The disease was consuming me completely. Every day was a battle to remember who I was, who the people around me were. The photographs spread around my room in the asylum, which previously brought comfort, now caused me anguish. I looked at images of happy times, trying to force my brain to remember, but all I got was a feeling of loss and despair. The void where there was once love and life became a constant presence. It was as if a thick fog had descended over my mind, erasing all the colors and emotions that had once defined my existence. I tried to talk about my children with the nurses, but the words often failed to form a coherent meaning. I felt like a stranger in my own story, disconnected from everything that once mattered. Memory lapses became more frequent and intense. I ended up not recognizing my own reflection in the mirror. My children's visits, when they happened, were a mix of confusion and embarrassment. I tried to remember, I tried to reconnect, but the illness pulled me into an abyss of forgetfulness. Seeing the disappointment and sadness in their eyes was a devastating blow, increasing my sense of helplessness and loss. As the disease progressed, my identity disintegrated. It wasn't just my memory that was disappearing, but my essence, my ability to feel and express love. What was left was an empty shell, a person struggling to maintain a sense of normalcy in a world that was constantly changing and fragmenting. Every day was a struggle to maintain some vestige of who I was, but the disease was winning. Forgotten memories were cruel testimony to the progression of Alzheimer's. What was once a life full of love, laughter, and meaningful connections was now a field ravaged by disease. The emptiness left by forgetting was unbearable, a constant reminder that he was losing the battle against time and illness. The loneliness, now compounded by the loss of my own memories, was an almost unbearable weight to bear. One day, I woke up feeling a deep sense of emptiness. The room around me seemed quieter than ever, filled only with the echo of my own thoughts. I knew, with a painful certainty, that my time in this world was coming to an end. The light that once illuminated my life now seemed to slowly dissipate. In the cold, impersonal environment of the asylum, I took my last breath. My fragile and tired body surrendered to the inevitability of the end. There was no final reunion with my children, no last goodbye filled with unspoken words. I died alone, without the presence of those I loved most in life. The silence of the match contrasted cruelly with the vibrant memories that once filled my heart. My heart was heavy with sadness, but also with calm resignation. During my life, I have faced challenges that seemed insurmountable. I raised my children alone, watched them grow up and go off to live their own lives. I faced the pain of loneliness, the devastation of illness. Now, he faced the final moment with a mixture of acceptance and farewell. My journey was over. There were no more fights or tears left. The disease, which had stolen so many memories, had also freed me from earthly anguish. In my last breath, I found a serene silence, a place where fading memories found rest. I knew that my legacy would continue in the hearts of those who were once my children, despite the distance and the failures. So, I closed my eyes for the last time, allowing myself to surrender to the eternal sleep that awaited. My body rested, finally free from the bonds of illness and loneliness. At the lonely end of my life, I found a peace I had long sought. Silence enveloped me gently, like a welcoming hug, as I said goodbye to this world that was once my home. After I leave, I hope my children understand the precious value of time and love. May they learn, from my lonely departure, to be there for those they love, before it is too late. Over the years, I have given my all for them, even in the most difficult and lonely times. Despite the pain I felt in my later years, my love for them never waned. It was the thread that wove our family history. I hope that as you look back, you will find a place for me in your memories. A place where I can still be present, not just as a figure from the past, but as a reminder of the unconditional love that brought us together. May they treasure not only the difficult moments, but also the shared laughter, the comforting hugs, and the life lessons that prepared them to face the world. Even though I'm gone, I know that my legacy lives on through each of them. May they find comfort and inspiration in the memories of the moments we lived together. May you never forget that, despite adverse circumstances, I have always loved you with all my heart. My greatest desire is for you to feel my presence, even if only in spirit, guiding you on your personal and family journeys. My children, you are my greatest pride and my source of joy. May my last words serve as a reminder of the transformative power of love and the importance of being present in the lives of those who matter to us. May you, as you face your own challenges and adversities, remember the love that sustained and united us, even in the face of the greatest difficulties. My heart is with you, today and always.